this evening I'm going to talk about chosenness, and we already know the answer to the question, and that is, of course, we are the real chosen people. If you happen to be Jewish, or if you happen to be Christian, or if you happen to be Muslim, there is some aspect of that in our sense of who we are as religious people. But I'm not going to talk about it in that way. I'm going to actually tell you 3 stories, give you 3 narratives, and then I'm going to read a piece of the book. You all have the handouts, right? You have the texts. If anybody doesn't have a text, raise your hand. Anybody? Everybody? Pretty much everybody has one. There are a couple people, maybe someone can pass them the texts. I tell my students, I teach a lot of text because I teach both at USC and at Hebrew Union College. At Hebrew Union College, I teach students who are training to become rabbis and Jewish educators, and we study a lot of religious text. And we talk a lot about text, and I tell my students always, never believe anyone who stands in front of you and says the good book says this, or the good book says that. Insist on them giving you the text. Because I can say anything. I'm an authority, right? I'm a rabbi. I'm a professor. I can tell you the good book says this, and you shouldn't believe me. No one should believe anyone who stands in front of you and tells you what Scripture says unless you have a copy of the Scripture in front of you, because I can say anything I want to. So I'm giving you the copies of Scripture, or at least the pieces that we're going to be looking at this evening. I'm going to give you more than what we're going to look at this evening. And having done that, you still shouldn't trust me, because keep in mind that I have selected those texts to give you. I could have selected another set of texts, and I probably could tell you a different story. So you have to be careful about what texts are being given to you. Remember that Scripture is like a sea. It's like an ocean. It has a lot of material in it, and there are many ways to understand the material of Scripture, and you have to be sensitive to that as well when you're reading the text. So, okay, so I gave you the text. You're aware of that. You also have to be careful because I translated those texts. And I translated those texts a certain particular way, and I'm going to be reading them in a particular way. So you have to be a little bit suspicious about that as well. So having said that, I hope you'll trust me for the rest of the evening as I tell you these stories. Story 1. Living in Los Angeles, I'm in the movie business in my mind. And I look at the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to be using PC terms now. We don't call that text or that set of texts, that scripture, the Old Testament, because that's a theological statement that those books of scripture are the Old Testament. That is a testament of an old covenant that is now no longer really in force. That's a theological position, a Christian classical theological position. We don't want to take a theological position on that text, so the PC term for looking at the so-called Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible. So we'll be looking at the Hebrew Bible first. And in the Hebrew Bible, the first book, Genesis, is a book that begins with the creation of the universe. Now, it's really interesting what happens with this book, because what we do is we have a kind of focusing. It's almost like a movie. Sometimes you'll see the beginning of a movie, you'll see a big panorama shot, and then it will slowly focus on the characters or the theme or the environment, the location in which you're going to really center your view. And that's what happens in the Bible as well. First is God of the entire universe, not just the world, the entire universe. God creates the luminous lights in the heavens, creates the sky, and creates the earth. Then you have a first narrowing, because the history that is the Bible, because the Bible is very much a historical text, the Bible's history begins with the history of creation of everything and immediately begins the job of focusing. The first focus is on earth, on the world. And then God proceeds to create living beings. And God does this in a very systematic way. The Hebrew says, God says, Vayihi, Vayihi or, let there be light, right? Or he says, Yehi or, let there be light. And then the narrator says, Vayihi or, and there was light. And that's the trope. There's a kind of a rhythm. God says, Yehi something, and then Vayihi, it becomes. And that goes for the creation of the seas, the waters, the firmament, and then all of the animals on earth and animals in the water. Everything is equal. Yehi vayehi. Until you get to one specific animal, one specific creation, there's a new focus. The language changes, and we're focusing in now the history of the world, no longer the history of the universe. History of the world is now going to be focused on the history of humankind. The creation of humankind is different than the creation of every other creature on earth. Second narrowing. And so God creates Adam first, and then Eve, or in another version, both Adam and Eve together, or the man and the woman together. They're two different creation references. Some people say two different creation stories. And we proceed with the history of the universe, the history of the earth, through the history of humankind. Anything else, any living being on earth, any aspect of the universe that is going to continue in the story of the history of the world or the universe is through the history of humanity. And so we have 4 stories after creation, 4 stories about humanity. And those 4 stories are 4 stories of failure. What's the first failure? How do humans fail the first time? Let's hear it. What do? They eat from the tree. That was a no-no. That was a failure. God speaks to Adam. God speaks to Eve. They fail. Fine. Then the next failure is what? What happens in the next generation? Cain and Abel. And what is the error? What's the failure there? Fratricide, killing a sibling. Tempting, but not a good idea. What's the next failure of humanity? Noah and the flood, right? Humanity is violent. God decides we're going to end it now and start over again. Each time, God has a relationship with Adam and Eve. God has a relationship with Cain, at least, Cain and Abel. God has a relationship with Noah, but the relationship is fleeting. It's not all that involved. And then what is the 4th failure of humanity? No. 4th failure is the next story. The Tower of Babel. So there's a Tower of Babel. Humanity has great arrogance and hubris and decides it's going to get up to God, and God doesn't allow that to happen, and humanity becomes dispersed. Then we have the next narrowing. So first we narrowed from the universe to earth, then we narrowed into the creation from animals to humans, and now we have a new narrowing of focus in the book of Genesis, and that begins with chapter 12 of Genesis, when God has a special relationship with one individual. Who is that individual? That individual is Abraham. So let's take a look at the first text on the first page, Genesis 12. The Lord said to Abram, his name is Abram here, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you." Why did God choose Abraham? According to the book of Genesis. It's a trick question. Where does it say that in the book of Genesis? The answer is Abraham rejected idolatry. Where does it say that in the book of Genesis? It doesn't. All right. So the first reference to Abraham is the one verse before the first verse of Genesis 12. It's not there. I can assure you, don't trust me, look at it yourself. I can assure you, it doesn't give you the answer. The answer is not explicit in the book of Genesis. Abraham is chosen by God. God has a relationship with Abraham. And from then on, God's relationship with humanity changes. First, God places Adam and Eve in the garden, basically says, go for it. They fail. Cain and Abel, an instruction here or there, go for it. Cain and Abel, failure. The generation of the flood, total failure. The generation of the dispersion, that is the Tower of Babel, another failure. From now on with Abraham, there's a new modus operandi. God is going to be involved personally with this person and then his immediate family, and then his extended family, and his children who become a set of tribes, eventually a tribal nation. And now the history of humanity is no longer the history of humanity. It's the history of one community of humanity. And all the rest of the humans on earth, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Canaanites, the Moabites, you name it, all the people that appear in the Bible only appear insofar as they are in relationship with Abraham and his extended and family and descendants. It's the final narrowing of focus, and it all happens in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. Fascinating, interesting. Question? Who wrote it? That's a good question. Who wrote it? Who wrote the book? Now, here's the rules of engagement for this evening. You can ask a question, any question, but I may not answer it. The reason I won't answer it is either it will take us a little bit too far off topic and I'm very easily distracted, or because I don't have the answer and I don't want to let you know that I don't really know it. So I'll tell you it's off topic. The question of who actually wrote Scripture is a complex question, and we can't really deal with it this evening. I'm sorry. Okay, because we're gonna get distracted from the direction of where we're going today. So now we have Abraham, we have his family, and that special relationship between Abraham and his family and his descendants is defined in the Hebrew Bible through an institution called covenant. Covenant is a special relationship, and the covenant par excellence is described in Genesis chapter 17. That's the next box. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram here, and said to him, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. Now, I bolded walk in my ways and be blameless. That's because I think that is actually giving us part of the basic reason for the relationship between, or at least the demands of the relationship between God and Abraham. The Hebrew is hithalech lefanai v'hiyeh tamim. It means something like this, really. If you walk around in front of my face, this is God speaking, you will be innocent. You will be blameless. In the Hebrew Bible, until the last book, the last chapter of the last book in Daniel chapter 12, there is a reference to a world to come or perhaps a resurrection. But that's the only reference that is clear in the entire Hebrew Bible to something that happens to us after death that is related to our behavior in life. That is, that there is no sense in the Hebrew Bible of punishment in hell or reward in heaven. In the Hebrew Bible, punishment and reward is all meted out in this world. After you die in the Hebrew Bible, you go to a place called Sheol. It means something like the place of question. Everyone goes to the same place. Evil people go, righteous people go. There is no sense of heaven and hell in terms of punishment in an afterlife. That comes into the world of the Near East only at the very end of the Second Temple period, at the end, very end, and after the canonization or the formation of the Hebrew Bible. So one is rewarded or punished by God in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, solely on this earth, right? There is no sense of reward in the world to come. So God is saying to Abraham, I think here, if you walk around in front of my face, so I watch you, and you do as I say, and I am involved with you, and you respond to me positively, you will be blameless. If you're blameless, that means I will protect you. The gods in the ancient Near East protected the people who protected the gods. There was a symbiotic relationship. If you weren't good to the gods wouldn't be good to you. Here is a monotheistic image or notion of God, and God is saying to Abraham, you do the right thing and you will be rewarded. That's the basic statement that's being made here. Okay, so there is a covenantal relationship between God and a particular family. The sign of the covenant is circumcision, and that is the way it works for many generations. until the Israelites go down to Egypt when there's famine in the land. And after 400 years in Egypt, according to the biblical chronology, basically, they are redeemed from Egypt through an exodus. And they went down, there were 72 people who went down to Egypt. That is the 12 sons of Jacob and their families, 72 people. Do you know how many people left Egypt according to the book of Exodus? According to the book of Exodus, 600,000 males of fighting age left Egypt. 600,000 men between the ages of probably 16 and 24. If you then extrapolate a full population from that, you arrive at roughly 2 million. So according to the book of Exodus, 2 million people now belong to this community that started simply as Abraham and his family. And they left Egypt. And when they left Egypt, they went into the desert and they received a revelation from God in the Torah. This is a reaffirmation of that covenant slightly differently. It's a new version. Now it seems as if God can't have a personal relationship with every individual of the 2 million people in that community that is called Israel now. Israel. Israel is a term not in traditional Jewish lore and in the biblical world. It doesn't mean the modern state of Israel. It means the people of Israel or the children of Israel. Those are the descendants of Abraham through the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, and a number of other communities that joined them when they left in the Exodus. There are a couple of references that weren't just a kinship group. It wasn't just a genealogical relationship of all of those people that received the Torah or the revelation at Mount Sinai, but rather a combination of Israelites and other communities as well. And then at Mount Sinai, a new formulation of the old covenant is taking place. The covenant is renewed, and we see that basically in Exodus chapter 19. So it's also on page 1. I'll just read it to you pretty quickly, and you'll see that now, instead of a personal relationship between God and a small family, where the family has to behave in front of God properly, God is going to give instruction, which is called in the Hebrew Torah, instruction, and this huge, large, massive community now has to obey God's instruction that is written in the Torah and remains in that special relationship with God. If they do obey the instructions, they will be rewarded, and if they don't, they are punished. So Exodus chapter 19. On the third new moon, after the Israelites, that is Israel, had gone forth from the land of Egypt, Moses went up to God. The Lord called him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and declare to the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me conscientiously and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples of the earth. Of all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." That's a pretty strong statement. Now, the entire community is in a chosenness relationship, divine election with God. All of this is narrated in the text of the Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and this becomes a national literature through which, directly or indirectly, all three families of monotheism understand their origins. This story that I told you, and I told you, remember, I told you my version of the story. This story, in one way or another, is understood to be the foundational story of all three religious traditions. That's the first story that I'm telling you. Now I'm going to tell you a different story, a story about how religion functioned in the ancient Near East. In the ancient Near East, there wasn't really much of a difference between a tribal community and a religious community. Every nation, when I say nation, I don't mean a nation state. I mean an ethnic community, an extended ethnic community. Every ethnic community had its own ethnic god. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern world of polytheism, there were powers that were understood by the people that ran the universe, not just a single God, but a variety of gods. Okay, this is polytheism. And in the way it was practiced in the ancient Near East, there were powers or gods or goddesses who ran the weather, who were in charge of fertility to make sure that your crops came in, that your goats and sheep had babies so that you could survive. There were powers or gods that were associated with the weather. Did I say that already? And that also with the seas and the water, issues like that. But in addition to that, each tribal community had its own tribal god. And they had a very special relationship with that God. We know this. We know this not only from biblical writings, but from the writings that we've dug up in archaeological digs. We have confirmation between some sections of the Hebrew Bible and archaeological remains that include stories. We have a famous story about a conflict between the Israelites and the Moabites. It's told in the book of Kings. I'm sorry, in the book of Numbers. No, it's told in the book of Kings, I think. And it's also told in a stone. The same story of the same battles were told in a stone called the Moabite stone or the Mesha stone that actually said the same story, except that each side said they won. So can't get any corroborative information to know exactly who did. Someday we'll, in an archaeological dig, we'll find the DVD and then we'll know. But until then, we have to be patient. So all the various groups. So for example, the Moabites had a god named Chemosh. The Ammonites had a god named Milcom. The Philistines had a god named Dagon. The Tyrians from Tsur had a goddess named Ashtoreth. The Babylonians, Marduk. And the Israelites had a god as well. Now I'm sort of making a transition and I'm going to be a little bit, how do I say this? Syncretistic, sectarian, and heretical. According to current biblical scholarship, the Israelite community, that people that we call the Israelites or the children of Israel, were polytheists at one time, and they made a transition from polytheism to monotheism. It took many generations. What we think of when we read the Hebrew Bible today is we think of Israel as a monotheistic community, but there's a lot of evidence in the Hebrew Bible that it was a very difficult transition to transition from polytheism to monotheism. And the Israelites were the first community to do that successfully. The Israelites had a god at one point that was no more powerful than the gods of the neighboring peoples. And that god had a name, because all the gods had a name. Why did a god have to have a name? Because when you made an offering to the god, you wanted to make sure that your god got to smell the sweet aroma of the offering and not somebody else's god. So you said, I'm making an offering in the name of so-and-so, so that that god would smell the aromas. Now, that's important because in the old polytheistic system of the ancient Near East, there was a symbiotic relationship between the gods and the people. The gods needed the people as much as the people needed the gods. The gods were more powerful, but they needed to be fed by the people. How do we know this? Well, there's vestiges of it even in the Bible. But if you know the Gilgamesh epic, you know the Noah story in the Gilgamesh epic or the flood story in the Gilgamesh epic, the gods destroyed humanity on earth. Why did they destroy humanity in the Gilgamesh epic? Anybody know? Too noisy. Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that too. But it was a little excessive because once people were destroyed, the gods had nobody to feed them. And so when the Noah character, do you know his name in the Gilgamesh epic? Yes, Utnapishtim. When he made it to the island and he offered an offering of thanksgiving, the image that is in that book is phenomenal. It says the gods flew around the smoke of the sacrifice like flies because they were so hungry, because they hadn't been fed for such a long period of time. So it was important to know who your God was so that the sacrifice went to the right place. And it's also telling because by knowing the name of the God, oh, this is really fun. By knowing the name of the God, it says something about the relationship between the community and the God or the power that is in relationship with that community. What does it say? It says that there was more equality in the relationship than there would be if you had a relationship with a God whose name you didn't know. What does that mean? It's the psychology of knowing names. You know, have you ever been to a party and somebody knows your name and you don't know their name and you feel very much at a disadvantage? Yeah? Or you were dumb enough to walk down the street with a cap that had your name on it and somebody who you didn't know, like what happened to me when I was really nerdy. I mean, I got over it, right? The nerdy part, I think. I walked down the street and somebody says, "Hey, Ruvain." Oh, and I don't know who the guy was. He was bigger than me, and he made fun of me because I had a name on my cap, and I said, right, I felt really stupid because he had a certain power over me because he knew my name. I didn't know his name. There is a sense of relationship and connection of knowing names and knowing identification. In many cultures, baby children are not named until after they become viable. So that's so that the angel of death or the evil powers may not get them. So there is a sense of knowing names. The name of the God of Israel was made of 4 letters that we do not know how to pronounce in the Jewish world. Some Christian communities pronounce it Yahweh, right? Or Jehovah. But what that really is talking about, what that is conveying, is that in the ancient world, the Israelites knew the name of their God, just like the Moabites and the Ammonites knew the names for their gods. But when at some point in history, the Israelites made a transition from a polytheistic relationship with a limited God to a sense of a universal, all-powerful, all-knowing God, it was impossible, it was inconceivable that they should know the name. You know, we don't know the name of God in the Islamic tradition either. It's just Allah simply means the God. It's not Frank, not Jim, not Penelope, right? So that seems to be indicative of that change. Now, if you don't believe me, and it's okay for you not to believe me, it's okay for you to be wrong. I'm continuing on this motif earlier. Let's turn to the next item on page 2, 2 Kings. I'm just going to read you the first couple of verses here. This is a statement about the reforms that were made by a king named Josiah. He destroyed all of the idols that were being worshipped in Jerusalem by the Israelites because he was a real staunch supporter of monotheism. Then the king ordered the high priest, Hilkiah, the priests of the second rank, and the guards of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord, this is yet, all of the objects made for Baal and Asherah. These were God, it was a god and a goddess, and all the hosts of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron. He removed the ashes to Bethel. He suppressed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to make offerings at the shrines in the towns of Judah and in the environs of Jerusalem. And those who made offerings to Baal, to the sun and moon and constellations, all the hosts of heaven. It goes on, there's a lot more. So Israel, this community, was the first community to make the successful transition from polytheism to monotheism. And Israel, and Israelites, eventually Jews, were associated with monotheism. They were the founders of monotheism. Now, there's evidence, by the way, that there may have been other communities that were monotheist even before Israel, or maybe proto-monotheist or nearly monotheist. One option is in Egypt, Akhenaten, who was probably at least a proto-monotheist, but it didn't survive. The idea didn't hold out. Israelites were the ones that were able to make it work and kept to it. And so the Israelites made that transition to monotheism. There's one thing I neglected to tell you in this story, and that is, when you have a personal relationship with a tribal god, you have a very special relationship. It's like we're made for each other. Your God helps you. When you go into battle against your nasty neighbors who live on the other side of the river and are peeing upstream, your God goes into battle with you. And their God goes into battle with them. And the more powerful God, or the better God, or the God who is better fed by his community through sacrifices, is the God that prevails. So there's a sense of intimacy between the community and its God. The community probably really loves its God as well as it probably fears its God. And that is a relationship that I describe as chosenness. It was like we were chosen for each other. It's an intimacy. Now, the Israelites had that notion with their God, and although we have no written evidence that the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Ashdodians or the Philistines, they never wrote, "We are the chosen people," that we have found in any text so far. I'm extrapolating. I assume that probably everybody in the ancient Near East had this sense of chosen relationship with their own God. Israel retained that sense of personal relationship with the God of Israel, because it's called the God of Israel in the Torah, when it made that transition to monotheism. So it associated its once tribal God, now the God of the universe, who is the God of all, with a special intimate relationship. It's an accident of history. Because how could the God of the universe also have a chosen relationship with one small people? It doesn't make sense. And yet it's so deeply embedded in the culture of ancient Israel that they couldn't let it go, even though there was some ambivalence, and we'll look at some texts that show that they were ambivalent about it. So the Israelites were monotheists, and they retained the sense of intimacy with the God who is now the God of all humanity. Now, what happened to all of those ancient religions of the ancient Near East? They all died out. The only surviving vestige of the ancient Near Eastern religions is the religion of Israel. And the religion of Israel, which is now Judaism, carries within it some vestiges of those old times. One is that sense of relationship with God, a kind of sense of chosen relationship, an accident of history. Now, all of the ancient religions died out by the Roman period, the end of the Roman period. And that's a longer story. It's in the book. I would tell you, you should buy the book, but what can I say? It's not here. Now I'm going to move up a little bit in history, and I'm going to end this piece of the story. When, in the period of the Greco-Romans, around the time of Jesus, and even before, 100 years before Jesus, there was a developing anxiety and malaise among many Greeks and Romans because they didn't really believe their old religious traditions. They were into philosophy. They were also into sacrifice. It didn't make sense anymore. The bickering gods in Olympus acting like humans. There was a better option. Here it is. There's one great God, a moral, ethical God who created the universe. Not bickering, not silly, not jealous, not having sexual relationships with humans and creating Hercules and doing dumb human things, but a transcendent God and a beautiful God, and a God that demands moral, ethical behaviors instead of the non-immoral or amoral behaviors of the gods of the ancient Greco-Roman world. And there was an option that was available, and that was monotheism. And monotheism was a package deal. There was only one option in the early period, and that was biblical monotheism. And that included a sense of chosenness. So when you bought into monotheism, you became chosen. You became part of the deal. And contrary to some popular beliefs, it was possible, and it happened a lot, that people converted to Judaism in the Second Temple period. Greeks and Romans became Jewish through conversion. That's the end of story number 2, story number 3, and we're going to move a little more quickly now. The last narrative is the story of the emergence of new religions. You know, there are new religions coming into history at all times, even in our own generation. What do we call new religions today? Cults. We don't call them religions, do we? Is cult a negative, a neutral, or a positive designation? Negative. On a good day, we might call a cult a sect. Might sound a little bit better. Sects are also negative. Why don't we call new religious movements new religions? Because they're new. Because we, most of us, certainly people, codgers like me, represent establishment religions. Establishment religions don't like new religions. Why don't establishment religions like new religions? Because new religions are threatening to establishment religions. Because maybe my children will not come home for Passover or for Shabbat and spend time with me. because maybe they're going to go and follow a new, I'm not going to say prophet, but I'll say guru, or some guru actually is not a negative term. It's only a negative term in 60s, post-60s American discourse. Because I, as a religious person, I am threatened by a new religious movement. What? My religion isn't good enough? And as an establishment religion, a representative of the establishment religion, I don't want a new religion to be successful. And so I do all I can to prevent the new religion from being successful. I call it a cult. I say it's a bunch of, we say in Latin, Narrigkeit. That's a Yiddish term, really. It means silliness. And the prophet is not a real prophet. And the message is not a real divine message. We do everything we can to prevent a new religion from becoming successful. And most religions fail. There are more than 2,000 religious movements have begun in the United States and Europe since the Second World War. It's been counted by academics who study new religious movements. Most of them fail. Some new religious movements succeed. By the way, what's the difference between a cult and a religion? The answer is 100 years. If you can live 100 years, you're no longer a cult, you become a religion. So today, and I don't mean anything negative in my statement, but there are new religious movements that were considered cults and had no respect at all, that now, after 100 or 150 years, are now becoming finally accepted as acceptable new religious movements, but with difficulty. Probably the most famous one is what? Baha'i and the LDS Church. LDS Church may be even more than Baha'i today, but Baha'i as well, right? So, okay, so now what makes a new religion successful? Now that's been an object of study in the academic field of religion for about 2 decades, maybe a little bit more. And there is a problem that new religions have, and that is, how do you demonstrate that you're authentic? How do you demonstrate to a pool of potential believers that what you have to offer them is real? How can I convince you that I'm really a prophet and the message I'm giving you is truth, and that I'm an emissary of God? The only way to do that successfully is to use paradigms that already are respectable. If I say to you, for example, I'll give you a great example. I'm a prophet. Now let's see. I'm a prophet now, okay? And I'm going to tell you my message, and my message might be lovely, very deeply moving, and very spiritual. And you ask me, how do I know what I know? And I'm going to tell you the truth. I receive my message from my, like it's like a transmitter in my pinky. You're already giggling. And the only time I really get that message is when I'm sitting on the toilet. More giggles. Now, that may be true. What if it really is true? What if it really does happen? I mean, it's possible that that could be. But I could never convince you of that because the paradigm is not respectable. It's not something that is seen as authentic. I need to demonstrate to you that I'm an authentic prophet, and my prophecy, not only the message, but the way in which it comes to me and the way I convey it to you is one that is recognizable to you. And so new religious movements always incorporate within themselves the motifs and symbols. Abraham, for example, he is the individual who is in relationship with God, the first and the most intimate relationship with God, at least in the ancient world. And so he shows up in not only in the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, but in the New Testament and the Quran as well. So when a tradition is successful, it's successful partially because it's able to utilize the motifs that have been demonstrated to be successful motifs in history. Chosenness was so deeply associated with monotheism in the ancient world that all new expressions of monotheism seem to, in one way or another, a little bit less so in the more modern period, define themselves as chosen people. You can see this with David Koresh. You can see this with a lot of movements in the 60s and the 70s. And because chosenness was so closely associated with authentic monotheism by an accident of history when Israel made the transition from polytheism to monotheism, that it became an item of importance. But then the question is, who's the real chosen people? And new religious traditions tend to make the case that they are the real chosen people. And so when Christianity emerged
as fumes. In today's society of America, the descendants of so-called American slaves have been advocating for reparations from the government ever since the tail end of the Civil War in 1865. But the government chose to ignore their demands as if they hold no validity, when publicly verifiable evidence proves it to be true. One example is Union Major General William Sherman issuing Special Field Order number 15 on January 16, 1865, which ordered that land confiscated from Confederate state landowners be divided up into 40-acre portions and then distributed to newly emancipated Negro families. Similar to how the government assisted incoming foreigners from other continents of the world ever since the 1840s. But this order was immediately eradicated once President in today's society of America, the descendants of so-called American slaves have been advocating for reparations from the government ever since the tail end of the Civil War in 1865. But the government chose to ignore their demands as if they hold no validity, when publicly verifiable evidence proves it to be true. One example is Union Major General William Sherman issuing Special Field Order Number 15 on January 16, 1865, which ordered that land confiscated from Confederate state landowners be divided up into 40-acre portions and then distributed to newly emancipated Negro families, similar to how the government assisted incoming foreigners from other continents of the world ever since the 1840s. But this order was immediately eradicated eradicated once President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. And Andrew Johnson was then elevated as the new U.S. president. Then all of that land was given to foreigners from other parts of the world instead, that just so happened to be welcomed here as immigrants in America that were hoping to ultimately undergo the process of gaining citizenship status with the federal government by way of being employed and obeying all government national laws, bills, statutes, and contracts. Now, this issue was brought to the attention of Congress ever since by numerous men and women who knew that they were entitled to their lands and demanded that pensions should also be included for their successful works, which was literally from the ground up into what it is today. And that's not an exaggeration. Year after year, this issue is brushed to the side by the government, and each presidential administration that moves into the White House continuously ignores it, whether Democrat or Republican. In the year 1989, which was 124 years after Special Field Order Number 15 was issued, Representative John Conyers introduced a bill labeled H.R. 40. And if this bill was passed, it would only allow for the creation of a study commission to study slavery and discrimination in the United States, and then study potential reparation proposals for restitution. And just a study unjust labor in the United States is being ignored still to this very day by the government. This asylum in the U.S., we are still seeing examples of this form of favoritism displayed by the government today. For example, just this past October of 2021, Joe Biden's administration, the Justice Department, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Homeland Security were reportedly planning to give $450,000 to each adult and child of immigrant families who were separated at the border under the Trump administration. According to reports from the Wall Street Journal, the payments would be made to settle lawsuits brought by the American Civil Liberties Union, representing those families, in which they were originally asking for $3.4 million per family, but Biden's administration countered with the $450,000 CLU, said in a statement that, quote, the Biden administration is correct to provide relief to the children and families affected by the government's horrific practice of family separation. The suffering is something they will always live with, and it is a deep moral stain on our country. We need to make it right. And this includes not simply any monetary support, but also a path to remain here. This is what is right and fair, end quote. Now, keep in mind that the Republicans are obviously against this payout. However, they are only advocating for the payout's amount to be adjusted due to the possibility of the payout's current amount attracting more immigrants and accelerating their plans to cross the border. But either way you put it, the government is literally giving reparations to immigrants and has been doing so ever since immigrants have been crossing the border seeking asylum, no matter their skin complexion. I mean, to the point where they're even exempt from standard immigration policies still today, as long as they use the code phrase, "I am here seeking asylum." The University of Texas at Austin Department of History states, quote, as early as 1917, immigration law had exempted asylum seekers from general immigration restrictions, end quote. So can you blame them for migrating here? Absolutely not. Because who wouldn't want to live in the best countries in the world where their needs are immediately met with the opportunity to empower themselves and their families for years to come, feed their families, and be gracefully compensated for even migrating here to begin with? And let's not forget how you'll be labeled as white by the US Census, no matter your skin complexion, so that you may enjoy the privileges, civil rights, and all the other benefits granted by way of the government, but from the fruits of the indigenous people's labors, who wants this government to do more than just literally giving reparations to immigrants and has been doing so ever since immigrants have been crossing the border seeking asylum, no matter their skin complexion. I mean, to the point where they're even exempt from standard immigration policies still today, as long as they use the code phrase, "I am here seeking asylum." The University of Texas at Austin Department of History states, quote, "As early as 1917, immigration law had exempted asylum seekers from general immigration restrictions," end quote. So can you blame them for migrating here? Absolutely not. Because who wouldn't want to live in the best countries in the world where their needs are immediately met with the opportunity to empower themselves and their families for years to come by gaining federally allotted lands to farm and feed their families and be gracefully compensated for even migrating here to begin with? And let's not forget how you'll be labeled as white by the US Census, no matter your skin complexion, so that you may enjoy the privileges, civil rights, and all the other benefits granted by way of the government. But from the fruits of the indigenous people's labors, who wants this government to do more study commission to study the effects of what really happened here during America's founding. So is this capitalism, prejudice, racism, and favoritism all wrapped up in one? Or is it just the government ignoring the blacks?
You make kind of a provocative comment in your book here, Mug, and I think it's on page 151. You write that various groups, feminist, gay rights groups, and those who are defending immigrants have commandeered the black civil rights experience. Yes. What do you mean by that?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that because I think it's one of the most important points of the book. I mean, I think the way liberals have treated blacks like children and many of their policies have been harmful to blacks. At least they got the beneficiary group right. We do have to, I mean, we shouldn't, there is the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws. We don't owe the homeless. We don't owe feminists. We don't owe women who are desirous of having abortions, but that's, or gays who want to get married to one another. That's what civil rights has become for much of the left. They dropped the blacks after 5 minutes.
Immigrant rights are not civil rights?
No, I think civil rights are for blacks.
See, this is essentially the problem. And the Republicans...
What have we done to the immigrants? We owe black people something. We have a legacy of slavery. Immigrants haven't even been in this country.
But you see, most of us are either immigrants or are the descendants of immigrants. And we understand, not everybody, there are Native Americans in, but we understand in this country,
people must understand why it is essential to disassociate themselves with politically correct words, like, for example, black and white, as their means of description when labeling themselves as a group of people by skin tone. Because in physics, the correspondence of color to a specific wavelength is called spectral color. Black and white, in this sense, are both absent of color, because while black absorbs the light, white refracts it, meaning that they both do not carry specific wavelengths, even though in the visual arts field, they are occasionally defined as colors, but only by common public opinion. So when the US Census labels citizens as black or white as their classifications of race, it is not done so under a descriptive means by way of a person's physical skin hue. It strictly serves as a social construct which is the meaning, notion, or connotation placed upon a specific group of people by an entire society and then later adopted by that same specific group of people with respect to how the other people of that entire society views or deals with that specific group of people. In other words, a social construct is a title or name that was given to our people by strangers, and then eventually our people adopted it as their own. And that's a big no-no. Because what if the government isn't responding to our demands for reparations and restitution only because we are agreeing to being labeled as something we are not, but that they want us to be? I mean, think about it. Doesn't that count as making yourselves non-existent when referring to yourself as black, since black can't be seen anyway? But what we can see is thousands of our people complaining about a white privilege that particular people are in fact receiving from the government. And we didn't think about calling ourselves for who we really are as the fix to this discrimination yet? Would you believe that there are foreigners from other places of the world, regardless of their skin complexion, gaining this white status or white privilege immediately upon arriving here in America as undocumented immigrants, and that's before they even become legalized U.S. citizens and then labeled as white on the U.S. Census? Like, did you ever wonder, when did the Caucasian race become legalized first-class citizens of America? Since they too carry a history of immigrating to America as foreigners from other places. And as more immigrants arrive here in America, the government continued to assist those newcomers by modifying their pre-existing immigration laws. This is called immigration reform, which is merely a change to the current immigration policy of a country, city, or state by granting easier pathways for foreigners to become U.S. citizens, like by way of payment, for example, when some presidents will drop the cost down or raise the cost up for things. Another example is during the Bush and Obama administration, legislation was crafted that tightened up border security, but also proposed a way for people who did not have legal status to earn legal permanent residency, which an immigrant must have before trying to become a citizen. Another example is comedian Michael Blackson publicly celebrating on social media that he officially became a U.S. citizen on November 24th, 2021. The 48-year-old Ghana native posted a photo on Instagram to his 5 million followers, waving a small U.S. flag with the caption reading, quote, "They finally made me an American citizen. Only foreigners will understand why I'm smiling and what we go through to get a green card or citizenship." He also posted his green card on his Twitter account, being sure to block out his classification of race from being shown, leaving the comment, "Today, I'm turning this in back to the U.S. immigration. For those who don't know what this is, it's a green card. This is what every foreigner that comes to America would die for." Laugh out loud. Today, I'm turning it in for my citizenship can't wait to swear in so I can apply for welfare. Now, even though he may seem like he was joking right there, that's actually true in millions of cases for foreigners who are allowed to become citizens and are classified as white, which I just covered earlier in this segment. Now, what's very important to note here is that in August 2021 article written by Justice for Immigrants states that, quote, an estimated 10.5 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States and could be deported because of their lack of legal status. That number has declined since 2014. Approximately these individuals and contribute to their communities. But wait a minute. So if the Border Patrol grants an exception to the rules of this government, this just goes to show you that they are allowing them here and are in fact assisting them in more ways than just one. Why else would foreigners want to migrate from their mother country so badly and into this one without receiving some form of compensation for doing so? Nancy Pelosi, on the topic of immigration reform, she states, quote, our nation's immigrants are the constant reinvigoration of America. Each wave of newcomers brings their patriotism, bravery, and determination to succeed to our shores. And in doing so, makes America more American. As students and service members, entrepreneurs and public servants, parents and neighbors, these new Americans affirm our country's fundamental founding truth, that in diversity lies strength. We will never stop fighting to ensure that America remains a land of opportunity for those who work hard, abide by our laws, and dare to dream. End quote. These people are not seeking asylum or running from something or somebody or whatever story that your local and national news media station will create just to make the viewers feel guilty. According to their actions historically, the government's intention of allowing immigrants into this country is not that complicated. A few reasons is about manipulating the U.S. Census numbers and recruiting useful foreigners into the U.S. military. For example, in an article created by Adebayo Adeleke of the Dallas Morning News, dated September 23rd, 2021, titled "The U.S. Military Needs More Immigrant Recruits," states, quote, "When Afghanistan fell to the Taliban last month, my heart broke. As a former military officer, I had traveled to the country many times, commanding troops on the ground and helping to build roads and bridges. The Afghan allies who worked alongside American soldiers deserved better. Their lives are now in grave danger. To abandon them now is un-American. Welcoming these allies and their families can also strengthen our country in the years to come. I know this because it is my story. I came to America from Nigeria in 1996. I spent 2 decades in the U.S. Army, leading troops and shepherding supplies across borders before launching a supply chain consulting business in Dallas. Today, I am a successful entrepreneur, an effective manager to both veteran and immigrant employees. Refugees are more likely to start businesses than American-born citizens. They have higher retention rates, and after 25 years in the country, they have higher median incomes than the American average, according to New American Economy. End quote. This government even for the original indigenous people that built this country? Or is this government only for the other people that they allow into this country? I'm just here to make you think.